The knock on the door came at the worst possible moment. Cassandra Whitmore stood frozen at the top of the staircase, listening to her father's voice crack as he shouted for the housekeeper to fetch a fresh cravat. Below her, in the entrance hall, a footman in unfamiliar livery waited with a folded letter in his gloved hand. She did not need to read it to know what it meant. Her father owed money, and the men he owed it to had grown tired of waiting. She came down the stairs slowly, smoothing the front of her worn gray dress, the same one she had mended twice that winter. Her father, Baron Edmund Whitmore, stood in the hall with his back straight and his hands trembling. He turned to her the moment he saw her and pressed a finger to his lips before she had even spoken a word. "Say nothing," he whispered. "Whatever is said in that room, you say nothing." Cassandra had heard those words so many times in her 22 years that they no longer startled her. Silence was the family's oldest habit. She had learned it before she had learned to dance, before she had learned to curtsy, before she had learned anything else that a baron's daughter was supposed to know. Say nothing about the debts, say nothing about the accounts, say nothing about the letter locked in her father's desk drawer, the one she had glimpsed only once, years ago, and had never been allowed to ask about again. "Who has come, father?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer would only frighten her further. "The Duke of Ashbourne," he said, and for a moment his voice lost all its sharpness. "He has come himself, not a solicitor, not a clerk, the Duke." Cassandra's stomach tightened. She had heard of the Duke of Ashbourne the way most people in her circle had heard of him, through rumor rather than acquaintance. He was said to be a man who spoke rarely and forgave never, a man whose fortune had grown so large that lesser men avoided owing him even a single shilling. That her father owed him a debt at all was troubling. That the Duke had come in person, rather than sending a representative to collect it, was something far worse. The butler, Mr. Finch, opened the door to the drawing room, and Cassandra caught her first glimpse of the man who had thrown her father into such a state. The Duke of Ashbourne was tall, dressed in unadorned black, and he carried himself with the stillness of someone who had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. His eyes, when they passed briefly over Cassandra, held no warmth and no cruelty either. They simply observed, as though he were reading a ledger rather than looking at a person. "Baron Whitmore," the Duke said, and his voice was low and even. "I believe you know why I have come." Her father's hands twisted together behind his back. "Your Grace, I must ask for a little more time. The harvest this year was poor, and I am not here about the harvest." The Duke's gaze did not waver. "I am here about the sum of £11,000 which you have owed me for 3 years, and which you have failed to repay despite 4 written requests." Cassandra's breath caught. £11,000 was not a debt her family could survive. It was not even a debt her family could imagine repaying, not with the estate crumbling and the tenant farms bringing in less each season. She understood, in that moment, exactly why her father had begged her to stay silent. There was nothing she could say that would make the sum smaller. "Your Grace," her father tried again, "if you would only allow me to explain the circumstances." "I did not come to hear explanations," the Duke said. "I came to propose a solution." The room went still. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to quiet itself. Cassandra watched her father's face shift from fear to confusion, and she felt her own heart begin to pound in a way she did not understand. "A solution, Your Grace?" her father asked carefully. The Duke's eyes moved, for the first time, fully to Cassandra. He studied her the way he might study a document he was deciding whether to sign. She lifted her chin, refusing to let him see how frightened she was, though her hands were cold as ice at her sides. "You have a daughter of marriageable age," the Duke said. "I am in need of a wife. I propose that your debt be forgiven entirely, in full, the moment she becomes my Duchess." For a long moment, no one in the room spoke. Cassandra felt as though the floor had tilted beneath her feet. She had imagined many outcomes for this visit: ruin, arrest, the loss of the house she had grown up in. But never this. Never a proposal delivered like a business transaction, as cold and precise as the numbers written in her father's account books. "You wish to marry my daughter," her father repeated slowly, as though testing the words to see if they were real. "I have made my terms plain," the Duke said. "I do not intend to repeat myself." Her father turned to her, and for the briefest moment, Cassandra saw something behind his eyes that she rarely saw there anymore. Something like desperation mixed with relief. He crossed the room quickly and took her hands in his grip too tight, his palms damp with sweat. "Cassandra," he said quietly, so the Duke would not hear. "This is our answer. This is everything solved. You must say yes." "Father, I do not even know him," she whispered back. "You do not need to know him. You need to save this family." His eyes darted toward the drawing room door, toward the man who stood waiting, with the patience of someone who already knew what her answer would be. Say yes, and say nothing else. Not about the debt, not about anything. Do you understand me? Nothing else. There it was again. The old rule, dressed up in a new and heavier disguise, say nothing. Cassandra had spent her whole life obeying that instruction without understanding why it mattered so deeply to her father, why even the smallest mention of the family's troubles sent him into a panic that seemed disproportionate to simple money problems. She had always assumed it was pride. Now, watching him grip her hands as though she were the only thing standing between him and disaster, she began to wonder if it was something else entirely. She looked past her father to the Duke, who had not moved from his position near the window. He was watching the exchange between father and daughter with an expression she could not read, neither impatient nor eager, simply watchful, as though he already knew more about this moment than she did. Your Grace, Cassandra said, stepping forward before her father could stop her. May I ask why you have chosen me? You do not know me either. A flicker of something crossed the Duke's face, gone before she could name it. I know enough, he said simply. It was not an answer, not truly. But something in the way he said it made her believe he was telling the truth, even if it was not the whole truth. She thought of the years spent being told to stay quiet, the letter she had once glimpsed in her father's desk, the strange weight that always seemed to settle over the house whenever anyone mentioned money or the past. She wondered, standing there in the cold drawing room, whether the Duke of Ashbourne knew something about her family that she herself had never been permitted to learn. I will need a moment to consider, she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. You have until tomorrow morning, the Duke replied. After that, I will consider the debt due in full, and I will pursue it through the courts. He bowed, brief and correct, and left the room without another word, without so much as a backward glance at the woman he had just proposed to marry. Cassandra stood in the silence he left behind, listening to the sound of his carriage wheels crunching over the gravel drive, and felt for the first time in her life that the silence her father had always demanded of her was about to be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. That night, she could not sleep. She lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, turning the strange proposal over in her mind like a coin she could not decide whether to spend. A marriage built on debt was not unusual among families of her class. She had watched other girls make similar bargains, trading their futures for their father's solvency, and she had always told herself she would never be desperate enough to accept such a fate. And yet here she was, considering it seriously, not only because the alternative meant ruin for her family, but because something about the Duke's stillness, the way he had watched her as though he already understood things she did not, had planted a small, unsettling curiosity in her chest. Why her? Of all the daughters of all the indebted families in London, why had he chosen her specifically, and why had he looked at her with such quiet certainty, as though the outcome of tomorrow morning had never truly been in doubt? She rose before dawn, dressed without waiting for her maid, and walked down to her father's study while the house was still asleep. The desk drawer where he kept his private papers was locked, as it always was, but she had learned long ago where he hid the key, tucked behind a loose board beneath the window. She told herself she was not looking for anything in particular. She told herself this was simply curiosity, nothing more. But when she opened the drawer and found the old yellowed letter she remembered from years before, her hands began to shake. It was addressed to her father in a hand she did not recognize, and though she only allowed herself to read the first few lines before the sound of footsteps in the hallway sent her hurrying to close the drawer again, those few lines were enough to make her understand that her father's insistence on silence had never been about pride at all. It had been about fear. She closed the drawer, replaced the key, and returned to her room just as the first gray light of morning touched the windows. When her father knocked softly on her door an hour later to ask for her answer, she was already dressed and waiting, her decision made, though not entirely for the reasons he believed. Yes, she told him, I will marry the Duke. Her father's relief was immediate and overwhelming, but Cassandra felt none of it herself. She felt only the quiet, steady beginning of a resolve she had never allowed herself before. Whatever secret her family had been guarding for so long, whatever the Duke of Ashbourne already knew about it, she intended to find out the truth for herself, even if it meant breaking every silence she had ever been taught to keep. Later that morning, a note arrived from the Duke's household confirming the arrangement and naming a date only 3 weeks away. Cassandra read it twice, searching the brief, formal lines for some hint of the man behind them, some sign of warmth or explanation. She found none. It was as businesslike as everything else he had said in her father's drawing room, and yet she folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer beside her bed, as though it were something worth keeping. Whatever waited for her at the end of those 3 weeks, she intended to meet it with her eyes open, no matter what her father had taught her to hide. The seamstress pinned the wedding dress a second time, and still Cassandra did not feel like a bride. 3 weeks had passed since the Duke of Ashbourne walked into her father's drawing room and rearranged the entire course of her life with a single sentence. In that time she had seen him only twice, once at a brief supper arranged by her father to satisfy propriety, and once at church, where he had bowed to her from across the aisle without approaching close enough to speak. Both times, she had studied him carefully, searching for some crack in his composure, some sign of the reason he had chosen her. Both times, she had found nothing. "Hold still, my lady," the seamstress murmured through a mouthful of pins, and Cassandra forced herself to stop fidgeting. Her friend Charlotte Gray sat in the corner of the room, watching the fitting with an expression somewhere between excitement and concern. Charlotte had been the only person Cassandra trusted enough to tell about the strange proposal, though even to her closest friend, Cassandra had not mentioned the letter she had found locked in her father's desk drawer. "You look as though you are preparing for a funeral, not a wedding," Charlotte said, once the seamstress had stepped out to fetch more thread. "I feel rather as though I am," Cassandra admitted. "Charlotte, I still do not understand why he chose me. There are dozens of women in London with better fortunes, better connections, better everything. Why would a duke travel across the city himself to collect a debt from my father, and then offer marriage instead of demanding payment?" Charlotte considered this for a moment. "Perhaps he simply admired you from afar. Men do such things, you know, even quiet, unreadable men like the Duke." "He looked at me as though he were reading a report," Cassandra said, "not as though he admired me." "Then perhaps there is a reason you have not yet discovered." Charlotte's voice grew softer. "You have always said your father hides more than he shares. Perhaps the Duke knows something you do not." Cassandra said nothing, but the words settled uncomfortably close to the thought that had been growing in her own mind since the morning she had opened her father's drawer. She had not dared to look at the letter again, fearful of being discovered, but the memory of those first few lines had not left her. Whatever the letter concerned, it had frightened her father enough that he had kept it locked away for years, hidden from his own daughter, protected with the same desperate silence he had demanded of her. That evening, as the household settled for the night, Cassandra found herself walking the halls unable to sleep. She passed her father's study and saw a thin line of candlelight beneath the door. Curious despite herself, she paused outside and heard voices, her father's and another she did not immediately recognize. "You cannot keep dodging the man forever," the second voice said, low and unfamiliar. "He has waited years already. My patience is not so generous." "The marriage will settle everything," her father replied, his voice strained. "Once the Duke's fortune is joined with this family, there will be no question of—" "The Duke's fortune will not silence what happened to Hale," the visitor interrupted sharply. "Money does not undo a ruined man's life, Whitmore. It only delays the reckoning." Cassandra's blood ran cold at the name. Hale. She had never heard it before, not once in her entire life, and yet something about the way the stranger spoke it, heavy with old resentment, told her it mattered a great deal. She pressed herself closer to the door, straining to hear more, but the voices dropped too low to make out further words. A moment later, footsteps approached the door from the inside, and she fled down the corridor before she could be discovered listening. She did not sleep at all that night. She lay awake, turning the unfamiliar name over in her mind, Hale, and the stranger's warning about a ruined man, and her father's desperate insistence that the marriage would settle everything. Whatever debt her father owed the Duke, she began to suspect now, was not the only debt weighing on the family, and perhaps not even the most dangerous one. The next morning, she resolved to learn what she could about the mysterious visitor, but her father gave her no opportunity. He kept close to the house all day, uncharacteristically attentive to her, asking after her wedding preparations with a nervous energy that only confirmed her suspicions. When she finally found a moment alone with him in the late afternoon, she asked, as carefully as she could manage, who had called on him the previous night. Her father's face drained of color. "No one of consequence," he said quickly. "A tradesman, settling an old account, nothing that concerns you." "Father," she said, "you have asked me my entire life to say nothing, to know nothing, to simply trust that silence was for the best. I am about to become the wife of a man I barely know, because of a debt I do not fully understand. I think I deserve to know what is truly happening in this house." For a moment, she thought he might finally tell her the truth. His mouth opened, and something like exhaustion passed over his features, as though he too were tired of carrying a secret alone. But then his expression hardened again, and he shook his head. "Some things are better left buried, Cassandra. Trust that I have only ever tried to protect you." He reached for her hand, his grip gentler than she expected. "The wedding will change everything. Once you are the Duke's wife, none of this will touch you again." She wanted to believe him. She wanted, more than anything, to trust that her father's silence had always come from love rather than guilt. But the memory of the stranger's voice, sharp and accusing, would not leave her, and neither would the unfamiliar name that seemed to carry the weight of an old and terrible wrong. In the days that followed, Cassandra found herself watching the Duke with new eyes whenever they crossed paths at the various obligations that preceded their marriage. At a dinner hosted by his aunt, the Countess Louisa, she studied him across the table, searching his composed face for any hint of the knowledge she now suspected he carried. He caught her staring once, and rather than looking away, he held her gaze steadily, as though inviting her to ask whatever question sat behind her eyes. She looked away first, unnerved by how closely he seemed to see her. Later that evening, while the gentlemen lingered over their port, Countess Louisa drew Cassandra aside into a quiet corner of the drawing room. "You are wondering why my nephew chose you," the Countess said, not unkindly. "I can see it in your face. Everyone wonders it." "I confess I am, Countess." The older woman's expression softened into something almost sympathetic. "Julian does nothing without a reason, my dear. He is not a man given to sudden fancies or romantic impulses. If he has chosen to marry you, it is because he believes it is the right course, not merely the convenient one." She paused, studying Cassandra carefully. "Whatever burden your family carries, I suspect he intends to help you carry it, not add to its weight." The words startled Cassandra more than she wanted to admit. "You know of my family's difficulties, then?" "I know enough to trust my nephew's judgment," the Countess said simply, and would say no more on the matter, no matter how gently Cassandra pressed. That night, riding home in the carriage beside her silent father, Cassandra pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window, and thought about everything she had heard in the last few days. A name she did not recognize. A debt that seemed to run deeper than money. A duke who claimed to know enough, and an aunt who spoke of burdens he intended to help carry. Whatever waited for her on her wedding night, she understood now that it would not be the simple, business-like arrangement she had first imagined. Something older and heavier than a debt of £11,000 bound her family to the Duke of Ashbourne, and she intended to learn what it was, whatever silence her father still tried to enforce. 2 days before the wedding, Cassandra decided she could no longer simply wait for answers to arrive on their own. She rose early, before her father had woken, and made her way to the small library at the back of the house where old newspapers and parish records were sometimes kept for reference. She did not know precisely what she was searching for, only the name that had lodged itself in her mind since the night she overheard the stranger's voice through her father's study door. She found nothing in the newspapers from the past year, nor the year before that. It was only when she pushed further back, into a stack of papers gathering dust near the bottom shelf, that she found a brief notice from nearly 6 years earlier. A man named Peter Hale, once a respected clerk at a merchant bank in the city, had been dismissed from his position and later tried for forgery. The notice was short, offering few details, but it mentioned that the case had relied on a signed bond bearing Hale's name, a bond he had insisted until his conviction that he had never signed. Cassandra sat very still, the old paper trembling slightly in her hands. A forged bond. A man convicted for a crime he claimed he had not committed, and a stranger who had come to her father's study in the dead of night, warning that money would not silence what had happened to Hale. The pieces did not yet form a complete picture, but the shape beginning to emerge in her mind was one she did not want to believe. What if the bond that ruined Peter Hale had never been signed by him at all? What if it had been signed by someone else, someone who had never faced any consequence for it? She thought of her father's trembling hands, his insistence on silence, the desperate relief on his face when the Duke's marriage proposal offered a way to settle his debts quickly and quietly. She thought of the locked drawer, the letter she had barely dared to read, and the years of being told that some things were better left buried. A cold, sick feeling settled in her stomach as she folded the old newspaper notice and tucked it carefully into the pocket of her dress. She did not confront her father with what she had found. She was not yet certain enough of the connection to risk another wall of denial, another gentle deflection that would only teach her nothing new. Instead, she carried the notice with her for the rest of the day, feeling its weight as though it were a stone sewn into her hem, and she began to watch her father not with the trust of a daughter, but with the careful, searching eyes of someone piecing together a mystery. That afternoon, Charlotte visited again, this time finding Cassandra so distracted that she abandoned all pretense of discussing wedding flowers or guest lists. "Something has happened," Charlotte said, settling beside her on the window seat. You have the look of someone who has seen a ghost." Cassandra hesitated only a moment before showing her friend the folded newspaper notice. Charlotte read it twice, her brow furrowing deeper each time. "You believe your father had something to do with this man's ruin," Charlotte said quietly. It was not a question. "I do not know what to believe," Cassandra admitted. "But I cannot stop thinking of the letter I found in his desk, or the man who came to threaten him in the night. Everything points towards some old wrong, Charlotte, something far worse than unpaid debts." "Then perhaps the Duke knows this as well," Charlotte said slowly. "Perhaps that is why he came himself, rather than sending a solicitor to demand payment. Perhaps he has known for some time, and has simply been waiting for the right moment to act." The thought unsettled Cassandra more than she expected. If the Duke already knew the truth behind her father's debts, then her marriage was not merely a transaction to save her family from ruin. It might instead be the first move in something far larger, a plan she did not yet understand, orchestrated by a man whose intentions remained as unreadable as ever. She thought again of his aunt's words, that he intended to help carry whatever burden her family carried, and wondered now whether that meant protection, or something closer to justice for a wrong that had waited far too long to be answered. The wedding was only a week away now, and for the first time since the proposal, Cassandra found herself not dreading the ceremony itself, but the conversation she suspected would follow it. If the Duke truly knew as much as his aunt implied, then perhaps her wedding night would not be the beginning of a stranger's bed, but the end of a silence that had shaped her entire life without her ever understanding why. The church bells were still ringing when Cassandra realized she had become a duchess without feeling like one at all. The ceremony had passed in a blur of cold stone and quiet vows, her father beaming with a relief so transparent that several guests had commented on it afterward, mistaking it for a father's simple joy rather than the desperate release of a man finally free from his debts. The Duke had stood beside her through it all, composed and correct, speaking his vows in the same low, even voice he used for everything, as though marriage were merely another transaction he intended to honor precisely. Now, hours later, the wedding breakfast finished and the guests departed. Cassandra sat alone in the grand bedchamber that belonged to the Duchess of Ashbourne, dressed in a silk nightgown she had never imagined she would own, waiting for the husband she barely knew to join her. She had spent the carriage ride from the church turning the newspaper notice over in her mind, along with everything Charlotte had said, along with the strange, unfinished warmth in the Countess's words. She did not know what to expect from the man she had married. Part of her feared he intended to claim what was legally his tonight and nothing more, the marriage bed as businesslike as the proposal that had led to it. Another part of her, the part she trusted less because it frightened her more, wondered if there was something else waiting behind his composed silence. The door opened, and the Duke entered without ceremony, already dressed for the night in a dark banyan, his dark hair slightly disturbed as though he had run a hand through it more than once that evening. He paused just inside the door, studying her the way he always seemed to study everything, carefully, thoroughly, as though committing every detail to memory. "You may relax, Cassandra," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name without the formal title attached to it. "I have not come to claim anything from you tonight that you are not ready to give." She had not expected such words, and for a moment she simply stared at him, uncertain how to respond. "Your Grace." "Julian," he said, "if we are to be husband and wife in truth, you may begin by using my name." "Julian," she repeated slowly, testing the shape of it. "Then may I ask why you have come, if not for what a wedding night usually brings?" He crossed the room and settled into the chair near the window rather than approaching the bed, putting a careful distance between them that she found strangely more reassuring than alarming. "Because I believe you and I have things to discuss that cannot wait any longer, and I would rather speak with you honestly than continue pretending this marriage is only about debt." Cassandra's heart began to pound. "What things?" Julian was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady on hers. "I know about Peter Hale," he said finally. "I know what happened to him 6 years ago, and I know your father's part in it." The room seemed to tilt around her. She had suspected, had feared, had pieced together fragments of a truth she did not fully understand, but hearing it confirmed so plainly, spoken aloud in her own marriage bed, struck her with a force she had not anticipated. "Tell me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please. I have spent weeks trying to understand what my father has hidden from me my entire life, and I am tired of guessing at shadows." Julian studied her for a long moment, as though weighing how much truth she could bear, and then he began to speak, slowly and carefully, choosing each word with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this conversation many times in his mind. 6 years ago, your father borrowed a significant sum from a merchant bank to cover losses from a failed investment, he said. He could not repay it on the terms agreed, and rather than face the consequences of default, he forged a second bond, using the signature and seal of a clerk who worked at the bank. That clerk was Peter Hale. When the forgery was discovered, the evidence pointed toward Hale rather than your father, because your father had been careful enough to disguise his own hand and implicate another man in his place. Cassandra pressed a hand to her mouth, though no sound escaped her. She had feared something like this, but hearing it laid out so plainly, so certainly, made it impossible to deny any longer. Hale was tried and convicted, Julian continued, his voice gentler now, though no less steady. He lost his position, his reputation, and very nearly his freedom. He served 2 years in prison for a crime he did not commit, and when he was released, he had nothing left, no employment, no standing, no way to clear his name. Your father, meanwhile, used the time and the confusion of the scandal to quietly restructure his own debts and avoid the ruin that should have been his. How do you know all of this? Cassandra asked, her voice shaking. How could you possibly know such details? Because Peter Hale is a distant cousin of mine, Julian said quietly. My mother's family. When he came to me 2 years ago, ruined and desperate, asking for help clearing his name, I made it my purpose to learn everything I could about what truly happened. It took considerable time and considerable discretion, but eventually I found the original bond, the one your father actually signed, hidden among old bank records that had been improperly filed rather than destroyed as he likely intended. Cassandra felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though she could not have said whether they came from grief, anger, or the strange, disorienting relief of finally understanding a truth she had spent her entire life circling without ever grasping. Then you knew all of this before you ever came to our house. Before you ever proposed marriage. I did, Julian admitted. I confess my first intention, when I learned your father owed me money from an unrelated transaction, was to use that leverage to force a confession from him, to clear Hale's name through whatever means necessary. But when I came to your home to collect the debt, I found something I had not expected. What was that? You, he said simply. I watched you in that drawing room, frightened and confused, told to say nothing while your father's crimes hung over your head without your knowledge. I realized very quickly that you were as much a victim of his silence as Hale had been, though in a different way. You had spent your whole life protecting a secret you were never permitted to understand. He paused, his expression softening slightly. I did not wish to destroy your father publicly and drag you through the scandal alongside him. I wanted a way to force the truth into the open without punishing you for a crime you never committed. So, you proposed marriage instead, Cassandra said slowly, beginning to understand the full shape of his plan. I proposed marriage, he confirmed, because it gave me a legitimate claim to your father's papers and accounts. Access I would need to gather the final proof required to clear Hale's name properly, through the courts, rather than through accusation alone. It also, he added, more quietly, gave me a way to ensure that whatever happened to your father in the process, you yourself would be protected, provided for, and free of whatever consequences followed. Cassandra sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing everything he had told her. Anger rose in her first, sharp and sudden, at her father for the years of enforced silence, for the crime that had ruined an innocent man while he escaped consequence entirely. But beneath the anger, something else stirred as well. A fragile, uncertain gratitude toward the man sitting across from her, who could have exposed her family publicly, and chosen instead to marry into scandal quietly, to protect a woman he barely knew from the fallout of a sin that was never hers. Why tell me this now? She asked finally. You could have kept your plans hidden and continued gathering your evidence without my knowledge. Because I do not wish to build a marriage on the same silence your father built his life upon, Julian said. If we are to live together, truly together, I would rather you know the truth from me tonight than discover it in pieces, the way you have clearly already begun to. His eyes held hers steadily. I promise you this, Cassandra. Whatever happens to your father when the truth comes to light, you will not bear the punishment for his crimes. I will see to that personally, whatever it requires of me. The weight of his promise settled over her slowly, and for the first time since the Duke of Ashbourne had walked into her father's drawing room, Cassandra felt something other than fear or confusion. She felt, unexpectedly, the beginning of trust, fragile and untested, but real. There is still the matter of the man who came to my father's study, she said, the one who threatened him about Hale directly. I do not believe that was you. Julian's expression sharpened with new attention. Tell me exactly what you heard. She recounted the conversation as best she could remember it. The unfamiliar voice, the warning that patience was not so generous, the mention of Hale by name spoken with old and bitter resentment. Julian listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening slightly as she spoke. "That was not Hale himself," he said when she finished. "Hale has no wish for confrontation. He wants only his name cleared, quietly and properly. This sounds like someone else entirely, someone using the same knowledge for a different purpose." "A blackmailer," Cassandra said, the words settling coldly in the room between them. "Perhaps," Julian agreed. "And if someone else has learned of your father's crime and intends to profit from threatening him with exposure, then our situation has grown considerably more complicated than I anticipated." He rose from his chair and crossed to the window, looking out over the dark grounds of the estate, as though searching for answers in the shadows beyond the glass. "We will need to discover who this person is, and quickly, before they act on their threats in a way that could harm you as much as your father." Cassandra watched him standing there, this man she had married only hours before, already speaking of protecting her as though it were simply understood between them, a given fact requiring no further discussion. Whatever this marriage had begun as, a cold transaction between a duke and a desperate baron, it was becoming something else entirely, shaped now by a shared secret and a shared purpose that neither of them had anticipated when they first stood before the altar. "Then we face it together," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. Julian turned from the window to look at her, and for the first time since she had met him, something that might have been the beginning of warmth crossed his composed features. "Together," he agreed quietly, and in that single word, the silence her father had built their entire family around began, finally, to crack. He returned to the chair near the window and sat again, though his posture had eased slightly since the conversation began, as though the weight of carrying his secret alone had finally lifted enough to let him breathe more freely. "There is something else you should know," he said. "Something that may help explain why your father has always guarded this secret so fiercely, beyond the obvious shame of the crime itself." "What is that?" "The bond your father forged was not simply a matter of avoiding a debt," Julian said. "Had the truth come out at the time, he would have faced prosecution for forgery himself, a crime that carries a far heavier punishment than unpaid debts alone. Transportation, at the very least. Possibly worse. He did not simply choose silence to protect his pride, Cassandra. He chose it because the alternative meant losing his freedom entirely, and leaving you and your mother with nothing." Cassandra absorbed this new understanding slowly, feeling it reshape, once again, everything she thought she knew about her father. It did not excuse what he had done to Peter Hale, the years an innocent man had lost, the reputation that could never be fully restored, but it explained, at least, the desperate, trembling fear that had colored every interaction she'd ever had with him, regarding money, or the past. He had not simply been ashamed, he had been terrified, every single day, that the truth would surface and take everything from the family he claimed to be protecting. "Does my father know that you know?" she asked. "Not yet," Julian said. "I have been careful to keep my investigation quiet, gathering evidence without revealing my hand. I did not want him to have the opportunity to destroy what remained of the original bond, or to flee before Hale's name could be properly cleared." He paused. "That changes now, of course. Once we begin searching for whoever threatened him in his study, he will likely realize that more people know his secret than he believed. Will you tell him tonight? Tomorrow?" "I think," Julian said slowly, "that decision belongs partly to you now. You are his daughter, and whatever he has done, I understand that confronting him will not be simple for you, regardless of the crime involved. I do not wish to move faster than you are prepared for, Cassandra, not on a matter that touches your own family so deeply." The consideration in his voice caught her off guard. She had expected, when she first learned the truth, that Julian would proceed exactly as he saw fit, a duke accustomed to acting on his own judgment without needing anyone else's approval. Instead, he was offering her a voice in the matter, a courtesy she had not received from her own father in all the years she had lived under his roof. "I need time," she admitted, "not to protect him from the consequences of what he did. Hale deserves justice, and nothing should stand in the way of that. But I would like to understand fully, myself, before I face him with what I know. I do not think I could manage it honestly otherwise." "Then we will wait," Julian said simply, as though the matter required no further debate, "but not indefinitely. Whoever threatened your father is a danger neither of us can afford to ignore for long." Cassandra nodded, grateful for his patience even as a new unease settled over her, the knowledge that somewhere beyond the walls of this house, a stranger held a secret capable of destroying her family, and intended to use it for purposes she could not yet guess. She thought of the sharp, resentful voice she had overheard, the warning that patience was not so generous, and wondered how much time they truly had before that patience ran out entirely. "Julian," she said, before he could rise and leave her to her thoughts for the night, "thank you for telling me the truth tonight, even knowing how difficult it would be to hear." He regarded her for a long moment, something unreadable but gentle passing behind his composed eyes. "You deserved the truth long before tonight," he said. "I only regret that it took a wedding night to finally give it to you." He rose then, moving toward the door, but paused with his hand on the frame to look back at her once more. "Sleep, if you can. Tomorrow, we begin finding answers together, not in secret, and not in silence." He left her alone with the candlelight and the weight of everything she had learned, and though sleep did not come easily that night, Cassandra found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, not entirely afraid of what the morning might bring. The letter arrived 3 days after the wedding, slipped beneath the front door of the Whitmore townhouse sometime in the night, and Cassandra found it before her father did. She had taken to rising early since her marriage, unable to settle into the rhythms of sleep with so much weighing on her mind, and it was during one such early morning visit to check on her father, now living alone in the house she had grown up in, that she noticed the folded paper lying just inside the entrance hall. There was no seal, no return address, only her father's name written in a hurried, uneven hand. She should have left it for him to find. It was not addressed to her, and she knew, even as she bent to pick it up, that reading another person's private correspondence was a violation she would not have permitted herself only weeks before. But everything about the past several days had taught her that her father's secrets were rarely his alone to keep, not when they touched Peter Hale's ruined life, not when they now touched her own marriage and safety as well. She unfolded it with trembling hands. The message was brief and unsigned, written in the same sharp, deliberate hand she imagined belonged to the voice she had overheard through the study door weeks earlier. It demanded a sum of £2,000, to be delivered within a fortnight, or the writer promised to bring the full truth of the forged bond before a magistrate, along with evidence sufficient to see Baron Whitmore imprisoned for his crime. Cassandra sat down heavily on the bottom stair, the letter shaking in her grip. Whoever this blackmailer was, they clearly knew everything: the forgery, Hale's wrongful conviction, details specific enough to leave no doubt that the threat was real and immediate. She thought of Julian's warning on their wedding night, that patience was not something they could count on indefinitely, and understood now, with a cold certainty, that the time they had hoped to buy for careful investigation had already run out. Her father found her still sitting on the stairs when he came down for breakfast a short while later. His face, upon seeing the letter in her hands, went the color of old parchment. "Give that to me," he said, his voice unsteady. "I have already read it, Father." Cassandra rose to face him, the letter held between them like a physical wall separating everything he had hidden from everything she now understood. "I know about Peter Hale. I know what you did to him, and what it cost him. I know because Julian told me himself, on our wedding night." Her father staggered slightly, gripping the newel post at the base of the stairs as though his legs might give out beneath him. "He told you," he repeated hollowly. "Of course he did. That was always his purpose, wasn't it? Not marriage, not kindness, simply a way to get close enough to destroy me properly." "That is not fair," Cassandra said sharply, surprising herself with the strength in her own voice. "He could have exposed you the moment he learned the truth. He could have dragged our family through a public scandal without a second thought for what it would do to me. Instead, he married me, to protect me from exactly this kind of consequence, while he found a way to see justice done for an innocent man you allowed to suffer in your place." "An innocent man," her father repeated bitterly, sinking onto the stairs beside her, all the fight suddenly draining from his posture. "You say it so easily, as though you understand what those years were like for me, watching everything I had built teeter on the edge of ruin, because of one foolish investment. I never meant for Hale to bear the consequences. I told myself, at the time, that the evidence would clear him eventually, that the truth would come out on its own. But it never did," Cassandra said quietly, "because you never let it. You let an innocent man lose everything, his position, his reputation, 2 years of his freedom, while you quietly rebuilt your own fortune and taught your own daughter to guard your secret without ever telling her what she was guarding." Her father buried his face in his hands, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. When he finally looked up again, his eyes were wet, though whether from shame or self-pity, Cassandra could not say for certain. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice small in a way she had never heard from him before. "This letter demands money I do not have. If I fail to pay, this stranger promises to see me imprisoned. If I do pay, what guarantee do I have that he will not simply return next month demanding more?" "None," Cassandra said honestly. That is how blackmail works, Father. It never truly ends until the secret itself is taken away from the person threatening you. Then what would you have me do? Confess everything to a magistrate myself, before this stranger has the chance? The question hung in the air between them, heavier than anything he had ever asked her before. Cassandra thought of Julian's promise on their wedding night, that whatever happened to her father when the truth emerged, she herself would not bear the punishment for his crime. She thought, too, of Peter Hale, a man she had never met, whose ruined years could not be given back to him no matter what happened next, but whose name might finally be cleared if the truth were handled properly, through the courts, rather than surrendered to a blackmailer's demands. I think, she said slowly, that you must let Julian help you, rather than continuing to face this alone. He has already gathered evidence proving the bond was forged by your hand and not Hale's. If that evidence is presented properly, through legal means, it could clear Hale's name and expose the true circumstances of what happened. It may not spare you every consequence, Father, but it would take away whatever power this blackmailer believes he holds over you. A secret cannot be used as a weapon once it no longer needs hiding. Her father was quiet for a long time, staring at the letter still clutched in her hands. You would have me confess, he said finally, publicly, willingly. I would have you stop letting fear decide everything for you, the way it has decided everything for this family my entire life, Cassandra said. You taught me to stay silent, because you believed silence would protect us, but it has not protected us, Father. It has only left us vulnerable to men like whoever wrote this letter, men who understand that a hidden secret is far more valuable than a confessed one. She left him sitting on the stairs, his shoulders bowed under the weight of a decision she could not make for him, and returned home to find Julian waiting in his study, reviewing papers spread across his desk with the same careful attention he seemed to bring to everything. He looked up the moment she entered, and something in her expression must have told him immediately that matters had grown urgent. What has happened? He asked, already rising from his chair. She handed him the blackmail letter without a word, watching his composed face harden as he read through the brief, threatening lines. When he finished, he set it down on the desk with careful deliberation, as though controlling the urge to crush it in his hand. £2,000, he said. And a fortnight to deliver it. This is someone who has done their research carefully, and who understands precisely how much pressure your father can withstand before he breaks. I told him we should not simply pay, Cassandra said, that doing so would only invite further demands. I told him he should let you present the evidence properly, before a magistrate, on his own terms rather than a blackmailer's. Julian studied her for a long moment, something like quiet admiration crossing his features. That was a difficult thing to say to your own father. It was necessary, she said. I am tired of watching this family choose silence over truth, no matter what it costs someone else. If clearing Peter Hale's name means my father must finally face what he did, then that is a cost he should have accepted years ago. He may not listen, Julian said carefully. Fear has kept him quiet for 6 years. It will not release its hold easily now, especially with imprisonment as the price of honesty. Then we will have to convince him, Cassandra said, with a determination that surprised even herself. Because I refuse to let this blackmailer control what happens next. Whoever they are counting on my father's fear to keep this secret buried a little longer, for their own profit. I would rather see the truth exposed on our terms than surrender to threats that will never truly end. Julian crossed the room and, for the first time since their wedding night, reached out to take her hand in his grip warm and steady in a way that startled her with how much comfort it offered. We will find whoever sent this letter, he said, and we will make certain that whatever comes next happens because we chose it, not because we were forced into it by fear. He paused, studying her carefully. You have changed a great deal in only a few days, Cassandra. I have simply stopped staying silent, she said. I find I do not intend to start again. Julian released her hand and moved back toward his desk, gathering the blackmail letter and holding it up to the window light, studying the paper itself as though it might reveal something about its author beyond the words written upon it. This paper is fine quality, he observed, not the sort a common criminal would typically use. Whoever wrote this has some means, or at least access to means. That narrows the possibilities considerably. Could it be someone connected to the original bank? Cassandra asked, moving to stand beside him. Someone who worked alongside Hale, perhaps, and knew the truth of what happened even at the time. It is possible, Julian said thoughtfully. I will need to review the bank's old records again, more carefully this time, looking specifically for anyone who might have suspected the forgery without ever coming forward. Someone who chose silence themselves, for reasons of their own, and has only now decided that silence might be profitable rather than simply safe. Or it could be someone close to Hale himself, Cassandra suggested. Someone who watched what the conviction did to him and has waited years for an opportunity to make the man truly responsible pay for it, in whatever manner they judged fitting. Julian's expression grew troubled at this possibility. I have not spoken with Hale in several months, since before I began this investigation in earnest. I had hoped to bring him proof before involving him further, to spare him the pain of hoping only to be disappointed again, if the evidence proved insufficient. Perhaps it is time I called on him directly, to learn whether he knows anything of this blackmailer, or whether someone in his own circle has taken matters into their own hands without his knowledge. Would he do such a thing? Cassandra asked. Blackmail, rather than simply seeking justice through proper means? I would not have believed it of him, once, Julian said slowly. Hale was always a careful, honest man, which was precisely why the forgery accusation destroyed him so thoroughly. He had no experience defending himself against dishonesty, because he had never practiced it himself. But 6 years of ruin can change a man considerably. I do not know what he has become in that time, not truly. I have only his letters, and letters can hide as much as they reveal. The uncertainty in his voice unsettled Cassandra more than she expected. She had imagined, when Julian first explained his plan on their wedding night, that the path forward would be relatively simple: evidence gathered, truth revealed, justice restored to a wronged man while her father faced whatever consequences followed. But the blackmail letter had introduced a complication neither of them had anticipated, a threat that could come from anywhere, motivated by anything from greed to a desperate hunger for revenge that had festered for years without release. Whoever it is, Cassandra said finally, we cannot simply wait a fortnight hoping the answer presents itself. If my father fails to pay, this person has promised to go directly to a magistrate. We must move faster than they expect, and find the truth before their deadline arrives, not after. Agreed, Julian said. Tomorrow, I will call on Hale myself, and press him for any information he might have, however small. In the meantime, I think it wise for you to speak further with your father. If there is any detail he has not yet shared with either of us, any name he suspects, any enemy he has made in the years since the forgery, we will need to know it. Cassandra nodded, though the thought of returning to her father's house so soon after their difficult conversation on the stairs filled her with a weariness she had not expected marriage to bring so quickly. Still, she understood the necessity of it. Whatever silence her father had maintained for 6 years, it could no longer be permitted to continue, not with a blackmailer's deadline drawing steadily closer, and her own safety now bound inseparably to whatever truth finally emerged. There is one more thing, Julian said, as she prepared to take her leave for the evening. Whoever sent this letter knows where your father lives, and likely knows a great deal about his daily movements as well, enough to slip a letter beneath his door unnoticed in the middle of the night. I do not like the thought of you traveling between our houses without protection, while this threat remains unresolved. I will arrange for someone to accompany you whenever you visit him, until we understand exactly who we are dealing with. The concern in his voice, quiet but unmistakable, touched something in Cassandra she had not expected to feel so soon in their unconventional marriage. Whatever this arrangement had begun as, a cold transaction born from debt and secrecy, it was becoming something she recognized now as genuine partnership, built not on romance in the way she had once imagined marriage might be, but on a shared determination to protect each other from the dangers gathering around them both. Thank you, Julian, she said softly, for taking this seriously, for treating my safety as though it matters as much as clearing Hale's name. It matters more, he said simply, and though his tone remained as measured as ever, something in his eyes told her he meant it entirely. Peter Hale's hands shook as he poured tea for his unexpected guests, and Cassandra understood immediately why Julian had once described him as a careful, honest man undone by circumstances he had never learned to navigate. She had insisted on accompanying Julian to the modest lodgings Hale now occupied on the edge of the city, far from the respectable banking district where he had once built a promising career. The rooms were clean but sparse, furnished with the careful economy of a man who had learned, through hard experience, never to assume tomorrow's security. Hale himself looked older than his years, his face lined with a weariness that spoke of 6 years spent fighting for a reputation he could never quite reclaim. Your Grace, Hale said, settling into the chair across from them once the tea had been poured. I confess I did not expect a visit so soon after your last letter. You said you were gathering final evidence. Has something changed? Someone has sent Baron Whitmore a blackmail letter, Julian said directly, without preamble. They know the full truth of the forged bond, and they are demanding £2,000 within a fortnight, or they have threatened to bring the matter before a magistrate themselves. Hale's teacup rattled slightly against its saucer as he set it down. Someone else knows, he said slowly. I had thought only you and I carried that knowledge, beyond Whitmore himself. That is precisely why I have come, Julian said. I need to know whether you have spoken of this matter to anyone in recent months. A friend, perhaps. Someone who might have taken it upon themselves to seek payment on your behalf without your knowledge or consent. Hale's expression shifted through several emotions before settling into something like offended dignity. You believe I would resort to blackmail, Your Grace? After everything I endured for refusing to simply accept an unjust conviction quietly? I believe nothing of the sort, Julian said, his tone gentling. But 6 years is a long time, Peter, and I know how deeply this injustice has cost you. I would understand, even if I could not condone it, if desperation had led you or someone close to you toward a path you would not have considered in better circumstances. Hale was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the worn floorboards beneath his feet. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a rawness that suggested the wound of his ruin had never truly healed, despite the years that had passed. I have told only one person of your investigation, he admitted finally. My younger brother, Simon. He has stood by me through everything, and I confess I shared my hopes with him perhaps more freely than I should have, given how close we have always been. He paused, something troubled crossing his features. Simon has never forgiven the men he believes responsible for my ruin. He has spoken, more than once, of making Whitmore pay for what he did to our family, in whatever way justice failed to provide. Cassandra felt a chill settle over her at these words. Do you believe your brother capable of sending such a letter? Hale hesitated, clearly reluctant to condemn family, even as suspicion visibly grew behind his eyes. Simon has always been the more passionate of the two of us, he said slowly, where I sought patience and proper process. Hoping the truth would eventually clear my name through legitimate means, Simon grew increasingly bitter as the years passed without resolution. He works now as a clerk himself, at a different institution, and has some skill with correspondence and legal language. I would not have thought him capable of blackmail before this moment, but I cannot say with certainty that he is not. Where might we find him? Julian asked. Hale gave them an address in a modest but respectable part of the city, his hand still trembling slightly as he wrote it down. Clearly troubled by the possibility that his own brother's misguided loyalty might have complicated the careful, legitimate path toward justice that Julian had been building for months. If it is Simon, Hale said as they prepared to leave, please, Your Grace, allow me to speak with him first, before any formal action is taken. Whatever he has done it out of love for me, however wrongly. I would not have him face the full weight of the law for a mistake born from loyalty. I cannot promise leniency for a crime as serious as blackmail, Julian said carefully, but I will allow you the opportunity to speak with him before we involve the authorities, provided he ceases these threats immediately and returns whatever evidence he may have gathered. Hale nodded gratefully, and Cassandra found herself moved by the obvious devotion between the two brothers, however troubling Simon's methods had proven to be. It was a stark contrast to the silence and self-interest that had defined her own father's choices for so many years, and she could not help but wonder what her family might have become if loyalty had ever outweighed fear in her own household. They found Simon Hale at his lodgings that same evening, a younger, sharper-featured version of his brother, with none of Peter's weary resignation and all of the bitterness that 6 years of watching an innocent sibling suffer could produce. When Julian confronted him directly with the blackmail letter, laying it on the table between them without preamble, Simon's face went pale, but he did not deny the accusation. You cannot know what it was like, Simon said, his voice tight with old anger, watching my brother lose everything while the true criminal walked free, rebuilding his fortune as though nothing had happened. I waited years for proper justice to arrive. When your investigation began, Your Grace, I believed finally it would come, but investigations take time, and evidence can be lost, and I could not bear the thought of Whitmore escaping consequence yet again through some legal delay or clever maneuvering. So you decided to take matters into your own hands, Julian said, his voice hard but not unkind, threatening exposure not to see justice served properly, but to extract payment for yourself. Simon's jaw tightened. The money was never truly for myself, Your Grace. My brother has struggled for 6 years to rebuild any semblance of a life. I intended the payment to help him, to give him some measure of the security that was stolen from him. Perhaps that was wrong of me. I do not deny it was wrong, but I do not entirely regret it either, not when proper justice has taken so long to arrive. Cassandra listened to this exchange with a complicated tangle of emotions. She understood Simon's anger, understood the desperate love that had driven him toward a choice he knew was wrong, in service of a brother he could not bear to see suffer any longer. It was not so different, she realized, from the desperate choices her own father had made, though born from an entirely different motivation. Fear had driven her father to ruin an innocent man. Love, however misguided, had driven Simon toward blackmail. Neither justified the harm caused, but she found she could not condemn Simon with the same coldness she might have expected of herself only weeks earlier. "The evidence gathered against your father," Julian said to Simon, "is nearly complete. Within days, I intend to present it formally, through proper legal channels, in a manner that will clear your brother's name beyond any doubt, and expose Whitmore's crime for what it truly was. I understand your impatience, Simon, but blackmail will only complicate matters, potentially undermining the very justice you seek by introducing a crime of your own into circumstances that should remain entirely focused on Whitmore's guilt." Simon's shoulders slumped, the fight draining visibly from his posture. "What happens now? Will you report me to the authorities?" Julian was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I will not, provided you cease this threat immediately, destroy whatever copies of evidence you have gathered independently, and allow the proper process to proceed without further interference. Your brother has already suffered enough for his family's sake. I have no wish to see him suffer further watching you face prosecution for a crime committed on his behalf, however misguided." Relief and shame mingled visibly on Simon's face as he agreed to Julian's terms, promising to withdraw the blackmail demand entirely and cause no further complications. As they left his lodgings that evening, Cassandra found herself reflecting on how differently this confrontation had unfolded from what she had expected, resolved not through punishment, but through a kind of measured mercy she had not anticipated from a man as composed and exacting as her husband. "You could have reported him," she said quietly, as their carriage made its way home through the darkening streets. "Many men in your position would have insisted on it. Many men in my position would have exposed your father publicly the moment they learned his crime, rather than marrying his daughter to spare her the consequences," Julian said, glancing at her with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "I find I am not particularly interested in punishment for its own sake, Cassandra. I am interested in justice, properly delivered, and in sparing further harm to those who have already suffered enough for choices that were never truly their own." Cassandra considered this as the carriage rolled onward, thinking of her father, still waiting anxiously in his house for a resolution neither of them had yet found the courage to bring him. The blackmail threat had been resolved, at least for now, but the larger truth still hung unspoken between her father and the justice that awaited him, a reckoning that could no longer be delayed now that the danger of exposure through a stranger's greed had passed. "It is time to speak with my father again," she said finally, properly this time, not to warn him of a blackmailer's demands, but to tell him that the evidence is complete, and that the truth will finally come to light, on our terms, rather than anyone else's. Julian took her hand in the darkness of the carriage, his grip warm and steady as it had been on their wedding night. "Then we will speak with him together," he said. "Whatever happens next, you will not face it alone." Cassandra held onto his hand for the remainder of the journey home, feeling, for the first time since her father's desperate whisper in the entrance hall weeks ago, that silence no longer held any power over her family's future. Whatever reckoning awaited her father, it would come now through honesty rather than fear, and she found she was ready, finally, to face it. They arrived at her father's house the following morning, and Cassandra noticed immediately how much older he had grown in the short weeks since her wedding, as though the weight of his secret, no longer entirely his to carry alone, had finally begun to show itself in the lines of his face. He received them in the same drawing room where Julian had first proposed marriage, though the atmosphere between them now bore little resemblance to that cold, businesslike exchange. "The blackmailer has been dealt with," Julian said, once they were all seated. "It was Peter Hale's younger brother, acting out of loyalty rather than greed. He has agreed to withdraw his demands and cause no further trouble." Her father's relief was immediate, though it faded quickly into renewed anxiety. "Then the matter is finished. We can put this behind us." "No," Cassandra said firmly, before Julian could speak. "The blackmail is finished, father, but the truth remains. Julian's evidence proving the original bond was forged by your hand, not Hale's, is complete. He intends to present it through proper legal channels within days." Her father's face drained of color once more. "You would still expose me, even with the immediate danger resolved? I would still see justice done for a man who lost 6 years of his life for a crime you committed," Julian said, his voice steady but not unkind. "That has always been my purpose, Baron Whitmore. From the moment I first came to your drawing room. The blackmail was simply a complication I needed to address before proceeding. It does not change the outcome you have known was coming since the night you first agreed to your daughter's marriage." Her father sat in silence for a long moment, his hands folded tightly in his lap, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost the sharp, desperate edge Cassandra had grown so accustomed to hearing from him over the years. "What will happen to me?" he asked quietly. "That depends a great deal on how you choose to proceed," Julian said. "If you confess willingly, cooperate fully with clearing Hale's name, and make what restitution you are able, the courts may show considerably more leniency than if you continue to resist and force the matter through lengthy prosecution. I cannot promise you will escape all consequence, but I can promise that willing cooperation will serve you far better than continued denial." "And Cassandra?" her father asked, glancing toward his daughter with something like genuine fear in his eyes. "What becomes of her when her father's crime is made public? Will the scandal not touch her as deeply as it touches me?" "I have already taken steps to ensure it will not," Julian said. "As my wife, Cassandra's position is secure regardless of what consequences you face. The scandal will attach to your name, Baron Whitmore, not to hers. I made that promise to her on our wedding night, and I intend to keep it fully." Cassandra watched her father absorb this information, watched the last of his resistance seem to crumble beneath the weight of a truth he could no longer outrun. When he finally looked at her directly, his eyes were wet with something that might have been genuine remorse, though she could not yet fully trust it after so many years of careful deception. "I never meant for it to go so far," he said quietly. "When I first forged that bond, I told myself it was a temporary measure, a way to buy time until I could find the money to repay the original debt honestly. I did not intend for another man to be blamed. I told myself, for months afterward, that the truth would surface on its own, that Hale would somehow be cleared without my involvement being necessary. But the longer the silence continued, the more impossible it became to break it, until I had convinced myself that speaking the truth would destroy everything, not only for me, but for you and your mother as well. And so you taught me to guard a secret I never understood," Cassandra said, "believing all the while that your silence protected our family, when in truth, it only protected you from facing what you had done." Her father had no answer for this, and the silence that followed felt different from all the silences that had come before it in this house, heavier perhaps, but also, finally, honest. "I will cooperate," he said at last. "Whatever Julian requires to clear Hale's name properly, I will provide it. I have carried this secret long enough. I find I no longer have the strength to carry it further, regardless of what consequences follow." Cassandra felt an unexpected wave of emotion at these words, not forgiveness, not yet, but something like the first fragile possibility of it, a recognition that her father, however deeply flawed, was finally choosing honesty over fear, for the first time in longer than she could remember. She rose from her chair and crossed to where he sat, taking his hand briefly in her own, an old habit from childhood that felt strange now, given everything that had changed between them. "Peter Hale deserves his name back," she said quietly. "Whatever else happens, promise me that much will be made right." "I promise," her father said, his voice breaking slightly. "Whatever it costs me, I promise you that much." As they prepared to leave, Julian paused at the door to address her father one final time. "The formal proceedings will begin within the week," he said. "I would advise you to consult a solicitor of your own choosing, someone who can guide you through what comes next, and ensure your cooperation is properly recognized by the court. This will not be easy, Baron Whitmore, but it will, at last, be honest." Her father nodded, looking smaller and older than Cassandra had ever seen him, but also, strangely, more at peace than he had appeared in all the weeks since the Duke's carriage had first arrived at his door. As she climbed into the carriage beside her husband, Cassandra found herself thinking not of the scandal that awaited her family in the coming weeks, but of Peter Hale, and the strange winding path that had finally brought his 6 years of silent suffering toward an ending he had waited so long to receive. "Thank you," she said to Julian, as the carriage pulled away from the house where she had grown up believing silence was simply the price of belonging to her family, for giving him the chance to choose honesty, rather than forcing it upon him entirely. "Everyone deserves that choice, at least once," Julian said quietly, "even those who do not entirely deserve the mercy that comes with it." The courtroom fell silent the moment Baron Edmund Whitmore rose to speak, and Cassandra gripped Julian's hand beneath the folds of her skirt, bracing herself for whatever came next. 3 weeks had passed since her father agreed to cooperate fully with Julian's evidence, 3 weeks of careful legal preparation, quiet meetings with solicitors, and the slow, painful process of watching her father confront the full weight of what his silence had cost. The formal hearing had drawn a modest crowd, mostly men from the banking world who remembered the original scandal and had come to witness its long-delayed resolution, along with a scattering of curious onlookers who had heard whispers of a duke's involvement in the affair. Peter Hale sat in the front row beside his brother Simon, both men dressed carefully for the occasion, their faces tight with an anticipation 6 years in the making. Cassandra had come to know them better in the weeks since their first meeting, had watched Hale's cautious hope grow slowly into something like belief that his name might finally be restored, and had watched Simon's earlier bitterness soften into gratitude, as the proper legal process, rather than blackmail, brought his brother closer to justice. "I stand before this court," Baron Whitmore began, his voice steadier than Cassandra had expected, though still carrying traces of the fear that had governed him for so many years, "to confess to a crime I committed 6 years ago, and to correct an injustice that crime caused to an innocent man." He spoke plainly after that, without the excuses and deflections Cassandra had grown accustomed to hearing from him over the years. He described the failed investment, the desperate need to cover his losses, the forged bond bearing Peter Hale's signature and seal, disguised carefully enough to escape suspicion at the time. He spoke of watching Hale convicted and imprisoned for a crime that was never his, and of the years of silence that followed. Silence born first from fear of prosecution, and later from the simple, cowardly inertia of a lie left too long unspoken to correct. Cassandra watched Hale's face throughout the confession, saw the complicated mixture of relief and lingering pain crossing his features as the truth he had insisted upon for 6 years, largely unbelieved, was finally spoken aloud by the very man responsible for his ruin. When her father finished speaking, the courtroom remained quiet for a long moment before the presiding magistrate addressed the matter of consequences. Julian's earlier advice had proven sound. Her father's willing confession, combined with his full cooperation in providing the evidence needed to clear Hale's name, along with his agreement to provide substantial financial restitution from what remained of the family's estate, earned him a measure of leniency he likely would not have received had the truth emerged through prosecution alone. He would face a period of supervised probation rather than imprisonment, along with the public disgrace that would follow him for the remainder of his life, a punishment perhaps lighter than his crime deserved, but heavier, in its own way, than any sentence of confinement might have been for a man who had spent 6 years hiding from exactly this moment. Peter Hale's conviction was formally overturned that same afternoon, the court acknowledging the falsified evidence and restoring his name and reputation through the same legal process that had once destroyed it. Cassandra watched him stand before the magistrate, tears finally breaking free after years of careful restraint, and felt her own eyes grow wet at the sight of a wrong, so long carried, finally being righted. Afterward, in the hallway outside the courtroom, Hale approached her and Julian both, his hand extended first toward his cousin, who had spent 2 years quietly building the case that finally freed him. "I do not know how to thank you properly," Hale said, his voice thick with emotion. 6 years, Your Grace. 6 years I spent believing the truth might never matter to anyone but myself." "You owe me no thanks," Julian said, gripping his hand firmly. "The debt, if there was ever one, belonged entirely to justice, and justice has simply been paid at last." Hale turned then to Cassandra, his expression softening further. "And you, my lady, I understand this could not have been an easy truth for you to face, given your own relationship to the man responsible for my suffering. It was not easy," Cassandra admitted honestly. "But it was necessary, and I would rather face difficult truths than continue living beneath comfortable silences that only protect the guilty at the expense of the innocent." She glanced toward her father, standing alone near the courtroom doors, watching the exchange with an expression she could not quite read. "I hope, in time, that you might find it possible to forgive him, though I understand if that forgiveness comes slowly, if it comes at all." Hale followed her gaze toward her father, and something complicated passed across his weathered features. "I do not know if forgiveness is something I can offer easily," he said, "but I no longer wish him harm, my lady. The truth has been restored. My name is my own again. That is enough for me to begin building a new life, whatever remains unresolved between your father and myself personally." It was perhaps as much peace as any of them could reasonably hope for on that particular afternoon, and Cassandra found herself grateful for even that small measure of grace extended toward a man who had caused so much suffering through his years of careful, cowardly silence. News of the scandal spread through London society within days, as such news always did. and Cassandra braced herself for the whispers and cold glances she expected to follow her wherever she went. To her surprise, the reaction proved gentler than she had feared. Julian's own standing in society, combined with the clear evidence that he himself had uncovered the truth and pursued justice honorably, seemed to shield her from the harshest judgment. Where her father's name became a byword for scandal and disgrace among the gossiping circles of the city, her own name remained largely untouched, exactly as Julian had promised on their wedding night. Countess Louisa hosted a small gathering only weeks after the courtroom proceedings concluded, and Cassandra attended with some trepidation, uncertain how the assembled guests might receive her. She needn't have worried. The Countess, ever perceptive, had clearly prepared the ground carefully in advance, and the evening passed with polite conversation and genuine warmth rather than the cold curiosity Cassandra had braced herself to endure. "You handled a difficult season with remarkable grace," the Countess told her privately, drawing her aside near the end of the evening. "I confess I worried, when Julian first mentioned his intentions toward your family, that he might be placing you in an impossible position. I am glad to see I worried needlessly." "I could not have managed it without him," Cassandra admitted, "or without your kindness, Countess, in welcoming me so warmly despite everything." "Nonsense," the Countess said briskly. "You are a Whitmore no longer, my dear. You are an Ashbourne now, and Ashbournes have weathered far greater scandals than this one across the generations, always by facing them honestly, rather than hiding from them. You have proven yourself well suited to this family, whatever difficulties brought you into it." The words settled warmly in Cassandra's chest, a confirmation of belonging she had not expected to find so completely within a marriage that had begun as nothing more than a transaction to settle her father's debts. She thought, watching Julian across the room in conversation with several of his acquaintances, of how much had changed since that first cold meeting in her father's drawing room, and felt a quiet gratitude for the strange, winding path that had led her to this new life. Her relationship with her father remained the most difficult thread to mend in the aftermath of the trial. She visited him for the first time nearly a month after the courtroom proceedings, uncertain what she might find in the smaller, humbler house he now occupied. He greeted her with a caution she had never seen from him before, as though uncertain whether she had come to offer forgiveness or simply to observe the consequences of his confession. "I did not expect you to come so soon," he admitted, showing her into a modest sitting room far removed from the grandeur of the house she had grown up in. "I did not expect to come so soon myself," Cassandra said honestly. "I am still uncertain what I feel toward you, Father. Anger, certainly, for the years of silence and the harm it caused, but also, I think, a measure of relief that the truth is finally free of us both." Her father nodded slowly, accepting this without argument, a change so marked from the man who had once demanded her silence at every turn, that Cassandra found herself studying him carefully, searching for the genuine remorse she wanted so badly to believe was real. "I have thought a great deal, these past weeks, about the man I might have become had I chosen honesty from the very beginning," he said. "I cannot undo what I did to Hale, or the years I stole from him. But I find, strangely, that confessing the truth has given me back something I lost long before my crime was ever discovered, a measure of peace I had forgotten I was capable of feeling." "I am glad of that, Father," Cassandra said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it sincerely. Forgiveness, she understood now, was not a single moment of decision, but a slow process built gradually through small, honest conversations like this one, conversations that could never have happened while silence still governed everything between them. In the months that followed, Cassandra watched her marriage transform slowly from the cold, businesslike arrangement it had first appeared to be, into something she had never expected to find in a union built upon debt and scandal. Julian, once so composed and unreadable, revealed himself gradually to be a man of quiet warmth beneath his careful exterior, patient with her questions, attentive to her opinions in matters both large and small, genuinely interested in the woman she was becoming, now that she no longer felt obligated to hide behind the silence her father had once demanded of her. She visited her father occasionally in the smaller house he had been forced to take once the estate's finances were settled to provide restitution for Hale, and though their relationship remained strained by everything that had passed between them, she found, with time, that she could sit with him, without the old fear that had once colored every conversation about money or the past. He had changed, in his own quiet way, no longer flinching at every mention of debt or scandal, no longer demanding silence from her about matters that had once seemed too dangerous to speak aloud. The lie that had governed his entire life for 6 years was gone now, and though what remained in its place was not an easy peace, it was, at least, an honest one. Peter Hale, with the restitution Julian had helped arrange and his reputation finally restored, found new employment at a respectable banking house within the year. His skill and integrity, always genuine despite the false accusation that had once obscured them, quickly earning him the trust and advancement that had been unjustly denied him for so long. Simon, too, found a measure of peace once his brother's suffering had finally ended, his earlier bitterness softening into something closer to contentment as he watched Peter slowly rebuild the life that had been stolen from him. One evening, nearly a year after her wedding, Cassandra sat with Julian in the quiet study of their home, reading while he reviewed correspondence at his desk nearby, the comfortable silence between them nothing at all like the fearful, enforced silence she had known throughout her childhood. She thought, sometimes, of that first cold proposal in her father's drawing room, the businesslike terms, the sense that she was simply a piece in a larger transaction neither of them fully understood at the time. It seemed, looking back, like a different lifetime entirely, separated from the woman she had become by everything they had faced together since. "You are thinking of something," Julian observed, glancing up from his papers with the same careful attention he had always given her, even from their very first meeting. "I was thinking of our wedding night," Cassandra admitted, setting down her book. "Of the promise you made me then, that whatever happened, you would protect me from the consequences of my father's crime. A promise I have kept, I hope," Julian said, setting down his pen entirely to give her his full attention. "You have," she said. "But I think, now, that the promise mattered less than what came after it. The choice to tell me the truth at all, rather than continuing to let me live inside silence the way my father always had. That was the true gift, Julian. Not the protection alone, but the honesty that made the protection meaningful." Julian rose from his desk and crossed the room to sit beside her, taking her hand in the same steady, warm grip that had comforted her through every difficult moment since their wedding night. "I did not marry you only to protect you from your father's crime," he said quietly. "I married you because I saw, even in that first difficult meeting, a woman capable of far more honesty and courage than the silence around her had ever allowed her to show. I simply gave you the opportunity to prove it. Everything since has been entirely your own doing." Cassandra leaned into him, feeling the quiet contentment of a marriage that had grown, against every expectation, into something genuine and lasting, built not upon the desperate silence that had once defined her family, but upon the hard, honest truths that had finally set them all free. Peter Hale from his wrongful conviction, her father from the lie that had governed his every choice for 6 years, and Cassandra herself from a lifetime spent believing that silence, however painful, was always safer than the truth. It had taken a stranger's proposal, a wedding night confession, and a blackmailer's threat to teach her otherwise, but she understood now, sitting quietly beside the husband who had once been nothing more than a cold transaction meant to save her family from ruin. That truth, however difficult to face, was always the stronger foundation. Silence had nearly destroyed everyone it touched. Honesty, however painfully it arrived, had finally set them free. She thought sometimes of Peter Hale, now settled comfortably into his new position, his reputation fully restored, occasionally exchanging correspondence with Julian on matters entirely unrelated to the ordeal that had once bound their families together in scandal. She thought of Simon, whose misguided loyalty had nearly complicated everything, but whose devotion to his brother had, in its own strange way, reminded her that love and honesty were rarely as separate as silence had once taught her to believe. And she thought of her father, slowly rebuilding a quieter, humbler life shaped now by honesty rather than fear, a transformation she could not have imagined possible on the morning his trembling hands had first pressed a finger to his lips and begged her to say nothing. Outside the study window, the evening settled softly over the grounds of the estate that was now her home, and Cassandra found herself, for the first time she could clearly remember, entirely at peace with the silence around her. A silence chosen freely rather than demanded out of fear, shared quietly with a husband who had taught her that the truest partnerships were built not on what remained unspoken, but on everything two people finally found the courage to say aloud. 2 years after the trial that had once threatened to unravel everything, Cassandra stood in the nursery of Ashbourne House, watching her infant daughter sleep, and thought of how far the family had traveled from the fearful silence that had once defined it. The child, named Eleanor after Julian's late mother, had arrived early that spring, and the household had settled quickly into the gentle chaos of new parenthood. Julian, who had once seemed so composed and unreadable that Cassandra wondered if anything could truly move him, had proven himself entirely undone by his daughter's arrival, spending far more time in the nursery than his duties strictly permitted, murmuring quiet observations to an infant who could not yet understand a word he said. "You will spoil her before she can even walk," Cassandra teased one evening, finding him exactly where she expected, seated beside the cradle with papers from his study, entirely forgotten on the table beside him. "I intend to," Julian admitted without shame. "She will grow up knowing nothing of the silence that governed your own childhood, Cassandra. I have promised myself that much at least." It was a promise Cassandra had come to trust completely over the past 2 years, watching Julian extend the same careful honesty to their growing family that he had first offered her on their wedding night. There were no locked drawers in this house, no whispered warnings to say nothing, no fear disguised as discretion. Whatever difficulties arose, and there had been several in the 2 years since the trial, they faced them openly, together, rather than burying them beneath careful silence the way her father once had. Her father himself had continued his slow, careful rebuilding and the smaller life circumstances had left him. He visited occasionally, always announced in advance now, always careful to respect the boundaries Cassandra had gradually established between them. Their relationship remained far from what it might have been had his crime never occurred, but it had settled into something honest, if imperfect, a quiet acknowledgement of past wrongs that neither of them attempted to disguise or minimize any longer. He had grown particularly fond of his granddaughter, arriving for his visits with small, thoughtful gifts and none of the nervous energy that had once characterized nearly every interaction Cassandra remembered from her own childhood. Watching him hold Eleanor carefully in his arms during one such visit, murmuring softly to her in a voice Cassandra barely recognized as her father's, she found herself considering, not for the first time, how completely a person could change once the burden of a hidden secret was finally set down. "She has your eyes," her father observed quietly, studying the sleeping infant in his arms. "I confess I did not expect to feel such tenderness toward a grandchild, given everything that has passed between us these last 2 years." "People are capable of more change than they often believe themselves to be," Cassandra said, settling into the chair beside him. "I have learned that much from watching you these past years, Father, however difficult the lesson was to accept at first." Peter Hale had visited Ashbourne House only once since Eleanor's birth, arriving with a small, carefully chosen gift and an invitation for Julian and Cassandra to attend the modest celebration marking his promotion to senior clerk at the banking house where he now worked. His reputation, once so thoroughly destroyed, had been fully restored in the eyes of London society, his integrity and skill finally recognized without the shadow of false conviction hanging over every interaction. "I do not know if I ever properly thanked you both," he said during that visit, watching Cassandra hold her daughter, while Julian poured tea for their guest. "Not simply for clearing my name, though that alone would have earned my gratitude for the remainder of my life, but for showing me that justice, pursued honestly and patiently, could still triumph over silence and deception, even after 6 long years of doubting it ever would." "You owe us nothing," Julian said, as he had said so many times before. "You survived 6 years of injustice with more dignity than most men could have managed. Whatever small part we played in restoring what was taken from you, the true credit belongs entirely to your own patience and integrity throughout that ordeal." Simon, too, had found his own measure of peace in the years since the blackmail scheme that had briefly complicated everything. He had married the following year, a quiet, steady woman who seemed to understand and gently temper the passionate loyalty that had once nearly led him toward serious consequence. Cassandra received occasional letters from him, warm and grateful, thanking her repeatedly for the mercy Julian had shown him despite his crime, mercy that had allowed him to build a life free of the shame that might otherwise have followed him permanently. On quiet evenings, when the household had settled and Eleanor slept peacefully in her nursery, Cassandra sometimes found herself thinking back to that first frightened morning, standing at the top of the staircase while her father pressed a trembling finger to his lips and begged her silence. She had spent so many years believing that silence was simply the price of belonging to her family, an unquestioned rule she had never been permitted to examine or challenge. It had taken a duke's cold proposal, a wedding night confession, and a blackmailer's desperate threat to finally teach her otherwise. "Do you ever regret how it began?" she asked Julian one evening, as they sat together in the quiet of their study, the fire burning low against the encroaching autumn chill. "The debt, the proposal, everything so businesslike at first, before either of us understood what we were truly building together?" Julian considered the question carefully, as he considered everything, before answering. "I regret the circumstances that necessitated it," he said finally. "The forgery, Hale's suffering, your own years of enforced silence. I would spare you all of that, if it were within my power to rewrite the past. But the marriage itself, and everything it has become since that first cold proposal, no, Cassandra. I do not regret that at all. I think perhaps it was always meant to become exactly what it has, regardless of the businesslike terms that first brought us together. She leaned against him, feeling the steady warmth of his presence beside her, the same quiet strength that had carried them both through scandal, blackmail, and the slow, difficult process of rebuilding trust with a father who had once valued silence over honesty. Whatever fears had once governed her family, whatever careful deceptions had shaped her earliest understanding of what love and loyalty required, she had learned, in the years since her wedding night, that the truest foundations were built not on what remained hidden, but on everything two people found the courage to finally say aloud. Eleanor stirred faintly in the nursery down the hall, and Cassandra rose to check on her daughter, Julian following close behind, as he always did whenever their child's comfort required attention. Standing together over the cradle, watching their daughter settle peacefully back into sleep, Cassandra felt a quiet certainty settle over her, steady and complete. Whatever challenges still lay ahead for their small, growing family, they would face them as they had learned to face everything since that first difficult wedding night, honestly, together, and without the fearful silence that had once threatened to define them all. Not every consequence of the past 2 years had settled so gently. Cassandra remembered, with some discomfort still, the winter following the trial, when word of her father's confession had reached distant relations who had long depended on the Whitmore name for whatever small prestige it still carried among their own circles. Letters arrived accusing her of disloyalty for standing beside Julian's investigation, rather than shielding her father from exposure entirely, as family loyalty supposedly demanded. She had answered each one carefully, explaining, without apology, that loyalty to an innocent man's ruined reputation mattered more to her than protecting a guilty man from consequences he had earned through his own choices. Most of those relations had eventually softened, or at least ceased writing altogether, and she found she did not particularly miss the ones who remained unconvinced. Charlotte Gray had remained her steadiest friend throughout every difficulty, visiting frequently in the months surrounding Eleanor's birth, and it was Charlotte who had first noticed how thoroughly Cassandra's manner had changed since her wedding. The quiet confidence that had replaced the careful, watchful caution she once carried into every conversation touching her family's affairs. "You are a different woman than the one I fitted for a wedding dress 2 years ago," Charlotte observed one afternoon, watching Cassandra manage the household with an ease that would have seemed impossible during those anxious weeks before the ceremony. "I confess I worried for you then, marrying a man you barely knew under such strange circumstances. I worried for myself as well," Cassandra admitted, "but I think, looking back, that the strangeness of how it began made the honesty that followed matter all the more. Had Julian courted me in the ordinary way, I do not know that either of us would have found reason to speak so plainly to each other so quickly. The circumstances forced honesty upon us before either of us had the chance to build the careful distances that so many marriages seem to settle into instead." Charlotte considered this thoughtfully. "Perhaps there is something to be said, then, for beginnings that do not permit comfortable pretense." "Perhaps," Cassandra agreed, glancing toward the nursery where her daughter slept. "Though I hope Eleanor's own beginning, whenever love finds her, proves rather less complicated than mine." The Countess Louisa, too, remained a steady presence in the family's life, visiting often enough that Eleanor had already learned to recognize her great-aunt's voice from the doorway, breaking into delighted sounds whenever the older woman entered a room. It was the Countess who reminded Cassandra, during one such visit, of the conversation they had shared in the earliest days of her engagement, when Cassandra had first wondered aloud why Julian had chosen her at all among so many other possible brides. "I told you then that Julian did nothing without reason," the Countess said, watching her grandnephew's wife with evident satisfaction. "I confess even I did not fully anticipate how completely that reason would grow into something far beyond the simple justice he originally intended, but I am glad, my dear, that it did. This family needed precisely the kind of honesty you have brought into it, after so many generations of guarding appearances above all else." Cassandra thought of those words often in the months that followed, turning them over alongside every other lesson the past 2 years had taught her. She thought of her father, still slowly rebuilding a life stripped of pretense, finding in that stripped-down honesty a peace he had never managed to locate during all his years of careful concealment. She thought of Peter Hale, restored fully to the respectable life that had once been stolen from him, and of Simon, whose misguided loyalty had nearly cost him everything, yet had ultimately led him toward a steadier, more honest version of himself as well. The Duke of Ashbourne's promise, made quietly in the dark hours of their wedding night, had proven far larger than either of them had first understood it to be. It had not simply protected her from her father's crime. It had freed her, finally and completely, from a lifetime of silence she had never chosen for herself, and given her, in its place, a marriage built on the honest foundation that silence could never have provided.